I think it's a really key image in the passage. It's actually where we'll start from today. The image of barrenness, that Elizabeth and Zechariah are without a child. And she's making the connection to that image and what is happening in the life of Israel at this point. You know, can you imagine in this sort of culture spending a lifetime not being able to have a child? When having children and being able to have sons even that carry on your name is something that's held in such high regard. And in a time when culturally to be barren, people thought maybe that said something about you and who you are and your faithfulness, your righteousness before God. It's part of why Luke goes to such great extent to tell us just how much this couple, Zechariah and Elizabeth, are righteous people. He says they both are descendants of priests, and they have been righteous and blameless before the Lord their whole life, but they were barren and unable to conceive a child. And that creates the tension in this passage, the dilemma in this passage, this lifelessness that they have lived with their whole life as they've been faithful to God and asking him for a son and longing for God to give them a son, and the years just passing and passing and passing until Elizabeth's ability to conceive is gone. And wondering, where is God in this barrenness? And it is exactly the kind of season that Israel as a nation is in. They have been longing and waiting for a Messiah, and there has been this great 400-year silence since they have heard the voice of God through the prophets. And Israel is a barren nation. They're living under the rule of Herod, and they're a conquered people, and they themselves are living in a kind of dry desert season. That's what barrenness is like. It's like a desert. It's like this harsh ecosystem that everything that comes into it eventually dries up and withers and dies. And life cannot be sustained there. And that is the strong parenthetical image of this passage, barrenness. This dried up desert place that Israel and Zechariah and Elizabeth have been living in, not just for weeks or months, but for decades and generations they have been living like this. And I think this passage is about barrenness and being in those barren places in our lives and the different ways that people respond when Jesus shows up in that desert. I think that's really there's a lot of things we could talk about in the passage, but I feel like today the thing that I want us to wrestle with is, what are those barren places in our own lives? Have you ever experienced that, those desert places? And the different ways that people respond when Jesus shows up in that desert. I mean, have you experienced something like that in your life? A desert? Some place in your life that has felt barren and dry and lifeless? Can you think of a place right now? I mean, barrenness, it's hard, and it involves a kind of waiting that lasts for generations and for years. It's a kind of irrational waiting, a waiting beyond hope. That kind of place where someone is hanging on and you sort of think they're crazy for hanging on in those circumstances that would test anybody's hope. Have you ever seen someone endure a season like that in their life? Have you ever witnessed that? Have you ever seen that in someone before? I read this story this week about this young couple in Korea. Well, they were young at the time. In 1950, they were living in Korea and they got married. They were between 18 and 20 years old. And they had fallen in love, and they had been married for just 7 months. And Miss Lee, the wife, she had been pregnant for just 5 months now. So they were very, very young married couple, this young pregnant woman. And right at that time, the Korean War broke out. And for the next 3 years, there was severe conflict happening in the country, and her husband got swept up in that conflict, and she didn't really know if he would come home or not. And for 3 years, the Korean War went on, and at the end of that third year, the conflict stopped, but the nation was divided by the Korean Peninsula at that time, North and South Korea. And she didn't know what had happened to him. Turns out he ended up on the north side of Korea, and she was living in the south with their young baby son now. And the years began to pass. And she didn't know, is he dead? Is he alive? Is there a chance that I'll see him again one day? And she wept so many days and so many weeks of her life, wondering what had happened to her young husband, and wanting to hope, wanting to believe that there might be a chance that she would see him again one day, but struggling sometimes to believe. It was like 20-something years later in the 1970s, she had a dream about him, and she couldn't figure out what the dream meant. She kept wrestling. Does the dream mean that he's alive and that I should hope and that I'm going to see him again, or does the dream mean that he's dead and I should try to move on with my life? But she never really moved on from the marriage. She didn't get married. She raised her son as a single mother. And years later, the North Korea and South Korea, they began to allow sort of these reunions to be organized between people who had been separated by the conflict, by the Korean Peninsula. And she didn't think anything of it. She wasn't sure if there was any chance of ever seeing him again. And 65 years after her husband had left to go to war, she got a phone call from the South Korea Red Cross, and they said, "Your husband is alive, and he has been looking for you." Can you imagine what it would have been like all those years, him looking for her and wondering and hoping she was alive, and the people in his life who must have told him he was crazy for holding on to hope, and the way that her own hope was tested, not knowing if he was there or not. And she went to see him, and her son was 64 years old now, and he went with her. They bought her husband a gift. She got him a watch and engraved their names on it, and they went to see him, and they sat there holding one another's hand. This old couple, 85 years old now. And he commented to her how he didn't know the war would do this to him, and she told him, she said, "I have cried so many tears till there were no tears left to cry for us." That's what it's like to be in a desert, to be barren, that excruciating waiting and wondering. Barrenness is like a desert that you get dropped in and you're told to wait, and not some short wait that tests your patience, but a long wait that will test your hope. And barrenness, it can take many forms in our lives, can't it? Barrenness can be a kind of dryness that happens. It's a loss or a long loneliness or rejection or emptiness. It could be some central relationship in our life that just gets so broken down and you just are longing for it year after year after year after year to be reconciled. It could be something that you've been asking God for in your marriage or in your singleness, desperate for him to do something new. Some pain or injustice you've endured, some struggle like depression or addiction. You just wonder, will I ever get out of this desert? Could be the waiting for meaningful work, to finally feel like you're doing the thing that God has made you to do, or some kind of kingdom dream, some kind of word that the Lord has whispered into your heart about what he wants to do among your people or your street or your neighborhood or your city, a thing that you want to start and see happen, and it just seems so impossible, and you wonder, will it ever happen? Have you ever experienced a desert? This dryness, this long waiting. And have you ever experienced it and then thought that the thing that you've been longing for might happen? And you began to hope, and you felt like you saw the end, and then it didn't happen? Has that ever happened to you? And what did you do? Did you give up? Did you lose hope? Did you keep going? Like Mr. Lee in this story? The barrenness in this passage involves such a long waiting that waiting has become institutionalized. And yet, somehow, there are people in the midst of that barrenness that have found a way to keep their hearts alive, to keep going. And we see these two ways represented in the passage of responding to God when he shows up in the desert place. Zechariah and Elizabeth. Their responses are different. One is skeptical, almost cynical, and misses God. And the other is grateful, almost worshipful, and somehow able still, after a lifetime of disappointment, able to believe that God is coming through for them. And so as I wrestled with this passage, I thought, what's the difference? What was different about Zechariah and Elizabeth? I mean, they've lived this life together, right? They've wrestled with this disappointment together. They've been in this desert together. They're both the descendants of priests. They're both faithful, righteous people, blameless before the Lord. So what is different? What has happened that they respond so differently when Jesus shows up, when this angel and Gabriel shows up? And I wonder, how can we keep our hearts soft and hopeful and not miss God when he shows up for us? As I reflected on Zechariah, I wondered for him if it just wasn't personal to him anymore. Follow me for a minute. I can't imagine what life had been like for him. The asking and the waiting and the life of faithfulness marked by the stigma of unfaithfulness. I can only imagine that waiting without answers, without any end in sight, it must be excruciating at times. Let me tell you about this really strange thing that happened in my family this year. There's this older woman in my family who, she's a great aunt by marriage, and she has come to family gatherings over the years a lot. We have a massive family, so when my family gets together, there's like 50, 60 people at minimum in the room. And she would come and eat meals with us. And I got a text from my mom way earlier in the year, and she just said, Dot has gone missing, and we can't find her. And she was an older woman. She had the early onset of dementia. They thought maybe she just took a walk to a neighbor's house, and so they began to search for her that night. And they searched for hours and for hours and for hours. And at one point, there was a small pond near her house, and they found a pair of her shoes right at the edge of the pond. And nothing else, no sign of her, nothing. It's really strange. This whole story is very strange. And so they searched, and they called in the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and they brought all the authorities that they could bring, and they drained the pond, and they brought cadaver dogs, and it was just sort of an ordeal for days. They looked for her, and they couldn't find any sign of her. And it was weeks later that some surveyors were working in a field, and they came across Dot's body. And so they started an investigation. They brought in family members. They put them through lie detector tests. They tried to figure out what had happened to her. And there were no answers. For weeks, there were no answers. A couple months pass. We haven't heard anything. And I get a call from my mom, and she says, Dot's grandson, who I had met at her memorial, has gone missing. He lived in a different town, and they found on a dock at a canal that he lived near, they found his shirt there on the dock, and nothing else, no sign of him. They investigated, they looked for him for months, and no sign. No answers about Dot, no answers about the nephew. And I'm not kidding you guys, this is the strangest story. A couple months later, I get a call from my mom, and she says Dot's son, who had been living with her, has passed away. They found him deceased in the home that he lived in with his mother, and they're not sure what happened to him. They did some tests. They think it was natural causes. But the whole time this is happening, I'm thinking about my uncle. It's my Uncle Tom who is the connection to Dot and her family. Dot is his mother. The young man is his nephew. And of course, his brother is the last person in the family that was lost. And I just keep thinking about him. And what will it be like for him to endure possibly a lifetime without answers? What will that be like for him? Will he somehow, in the midst of that, grow closer to God? Will he begin to blame God? I wonder, will that waiting somehow, will it change him? The going on and on without answers, will it change him somehow as the years go on? Because I think waiting, it can change us, right? I mean, we experience this every day, if you think about it. Even short waits, sometimes, that start out exciting to us. Some concert you're trying to get into, some ride that you're trying to get on, just being on the road. Some short waits, sometimes go from exciting to frustrating very quickly, right? Waiting can change us over time. I went on this road trip when I was young with my family. My stepdad was working out of the state a lot at that time because of his job, so he would be gone for a year at a time, so we would go in the summers and holidays to spend time with him, and this year he was in Michigan. So they loaded my brother and I up, and for Christmas break, we all drove up to Michigan. And my parents had decided that the way that they would make this trip fun is that they would wrap all of our Christmas presents. We got in the van early that morning to leave. There was a pile of Christmas presents, and they were going to give them out to us one by one, spread out over the course of this trip to Michigan, right? Seems like a really clever idea, and at first it felt really fun. We were like, oh my gosh, look at the pile of presents. We're going to do presents all day long. You're young, you don't really have a concept of how long a drive from Florida to Michigan is going to be. And you don't really figure out to the third or fourth gift that your parents have decided this game needs to last the entire drive. So you open the first gift, you're super excited, they're smart. It was like games you could play on the road, so we're playing, time passes. We don't even notice, right? Then you open the next gift, maybe another game, you play for a little while, time passes, you don't notice, you open the next gift. You sort of can't just get games all day long, so it's something else, not really something you can play with or that will pass the time. And you're like, okay, I'm here waiting. And after a few gifts, I noticed this big box that was sort of this really big gift that was under all the gifts. And that year, I had really wanted like an electric piano, like a big keyboard, because I played piano and we were traveling a lot, and when we were on the road, I didn't have a way to play. And I saw that, and I was like, I think that might be the thing I've been waiting for, you know? But there were all these other small gifts on top of it. And I had to get through all those other gifts before I was going to get the other gift. And it's like all of a sudden the waiting started to change me. And my brother and I, start begging, like, can we speed this up a little bit? Like, it's taking a little bit too long in between gifts, you know, we're like pleading. And then you start to feel a little bit bitter, like I don't like this game. It's not fun anymore. This game is sort of dumb. And then you sort of start to feel like, my parents must not love me. Like, the thing I have been wanting is right there, I think, and they're making me open all these little dumb gifts. Like, you start to get bitter. You're like, I want this game to end, you know? And by the time that last gift that I've really been waiting for comes, it's like, I'm happy, but I'm sort of not happy. Like, the last gift isn't quite as good because I didn't really enjoy all the gifts leading up to it, you know? There was something about the waiting changed how I felt about the gift I'd been waiting for. Waiting can change us. And I think for Zechariah, he had changed somehow as he waited in this barrenness. I wonder if for Zechariah, he had started to go through the motions. He was still being faithful. He was still serving and doing his duties as a priest. Still praying for the redemption of Israel, believing that God would come through for Israel, but maybe he had lost hope that God would still show up for him in his own personal desert. So when God shows up in this big way, and he makes this really big sort of cosmic but very personal announcement to him, He misses it. I mean, think about the theater of this moment, like the length that God has gone to get Zechariah to this place and make this announcement to him, right? It's like in just the right year, at just the right time of the year. He's a priest, and they sort of are divided into groups. And there were 20-something groups of them, and they would each serve about 2 years out of the year. When your group got called up, you would go serve. You would do your 2 weeks for the year. And when you got called to serve, they would cast lots, like we see in the passage. And there were probably only about 18,000 priests, maybe around that at the time. They cast lots, and out of all those people in his particular group, he gets chosen to go perform this sort of sacred duty of the burning of the incense. And it's something you only get chosen for once in your lifetime. And once you do it once, you can never do it again. And some priests never get chosen to do it ever. And here, in this moment, he gets chosen. On this day, at this time in history under the reign of Herod, they're crying out for a Messiah, praying for the redemption of Israel. And Zechariah has prayed his whole life for a son, and he's chosen. And he's there, and he's inside this most holy place. And the people are gathered outside, and they're praying. And he goes in to offer the incense. And as he's there praying, an angel of the Lord shows up. This has never happened to me in my prayer times. He's praying, and all of a sudden, an angel of the Lord is there, standing by the altar, looking at him. And like any time that people encounter angels, he is scared. He's afraid, right? And the angel says, "Don't be afraid," which is like, I think, a ridiculous thing to say to a person when you're an angel and you just showed up. He says, "Don't be afraid. Your prayer has been answered." And at first glance, I feel like, man, that feels like a really efficient prayer time. Like, you walked in, you offered some incense, angel came, he's like, your prayer is answered. But it wasn't like that, was it? I mean, what was the prayer that he was praying? I mean, it was a prayer of barrenness, right? Like maybe, I don't know, maybe on this day, at this special occasion, Zechariah had dared to pray one more time as he slipped in. I mean, he's going to pray for the redemption of Israel, but I don't know. If you have a chance to be there in the most holy place, and you have this thing you've prayed for your whole life, do you dare to utter that prayer again that day? Or maybe he was just praying for the redemption of Israel. This angel comes and he says, your prayer has been answered. God shows up. And Zechariah's response is this question: how can I be sure? How can I be certain that what you're saying is going to happen is going to happen? And it's ironic to me, right? Because Luke opens the book by saying, Theophilus, I'm writing this to you so that you can be certain of the things that you've been taught. And then here's Zechariah, and he's like, how can I be certain that the thing you just said to me is going to happen? And his response is, do you know who I am? He's like, I'm Gabriel. I come from the presence of God. And everything that I said is going to happen. And now you're going to be quiet for a while. I'm just like confused. I'm like, what was wrong with his question? I wonder if we don't hear the skepticism in his voice, the unbelief that God might still come through for him. I mean, even though he has everything he needs to believe that God will do this thing. I mean, he's a priest. He has served a lifetime in service of the people of Israel, caring for them, passing on for them the stories of God's faithfulness to his people, the stories of people like Abraham and Sarah, who when they were very old, 75 years old, the Lord said, I'm going to give you a son, and your descendants are going to be like more than the stars in the sky, more than the sand. And they still waited 24 more years, and God gave them a son. He's carried these stories for the people of Israel, of God's faithfulness. He has his own stories, probably a lifetime of stories of the ways that God has come through for him. And all these stories together, they create a pretty statistically reliable set of evidence that if an angel shows up and says your name and said God is going to do a thing for you, that God is probably going to do that thing for you, right? But it's like he stopped believing his own prayer. He stopped believing that God might come through for him. It's just not personal for him anymore. I don't know, it's like maybe his life with God had become more removed, more philosophical. He still hoped that God would come through for the people of Israel, but not for him. And I wonder for all of us, maybe, if under all of our struggling with barrenness in our lives is this fear, this loss of faith. Whether we're frustrated, annoyed by the waiting, or if we're full on bitter and questioning God's love for us in the desert, many of us can still say that we believe God is good and that God is at work in our city, but I think deep down we wonder, is he at work for us anymore? We've probably all tried to encourage people like this. Maybe you've known a person like that who has been in a desert and they just struggle to believe that Jesus wants to come through for them. Maybe their friends, maybe for their family, maybe for their microchurch, but not for them. Maybe that's you today. I'm here to tell you that God is here for you today. Elizabeth gets the same news, and she responds totally differently, right? She doesn't get much airtime in the passage. It's not quite the experience that Zechariah gets going into the most holy places and having an angel tell him the news. What she gets is her old husband coming home mute from his time doing these sacred priestly duties, maybe scribbling a note to her or trying to sign and hand gestures like, you know, that's how she gets the news maybe. There's no sonogram for her to get to be sure that what he's saying is going to happen is going to happen. She could have thought he was just crazy, or as she started to notice changes in her body, maybe I'm just getting sick. Not sure God is doing this, but she didn't. Somehow she believed not only that God could still do such a thing as give her a child, but she believed that he would do exactly that kind of thing for her. When she hears the news, her response in the passage is just this simple response. The Lord has done this for me. The Lord has done this for me. He has shown me his favor and taken away my disgrace. The Lord has done this for me. And she is in seclusion for these 5 months in her house, and I have no clue what that's about, but for me, it feels almost worshipful. Like, I don't know, is she there treasuring, worshiping God for what he's done in her life and waiting for the time when it'll be visible so that she can share it with the people in her community so that they too can believe what God is at work doing. I think for Elizabeth, it was still personal. She still believed that God was coming through for her. And I think this story is incredible as we look at Zechariah and Elizabeth and their two different responses to God when he shows up. Because this whole story is really a foreshadowing, isn't it? Of how people are going to respond when their son John begins to preach a message about the coming Messiah. And even more than that, it's a foreshadowing of how people are going to respond when Jesus himself shows up and says, "The kingdom of God is here. Repent and believe." And some will miss him, but some will know right away who he is. And I wonder for us, how can we keep our hearts soft and hopeful and not miss God when he shows up? Our life with God has got to stay personal. The work that you are doing, the work that God is doing, it's not just about the kingdom coming in our city. It's not just about justice. It's not just about the church or growth or the neighborhood. It's also about you. When God brings his kingdom, it includes you. God doesn't want to just work through you or around you. He wants to come and meet you in that barren place in your life. And we cannot give in to the lie that God will come through for our friends and our microchurches, but not for us. And I think some of the ways that we keep our hearts soft and hopeful is that we have to remember. We have to remember the stories of God's faithfulness. We have to come to places like this together to tell each other the stories of God's faithfulness to us. We have to remember the ways that he has come through for us in our lives. We have to nurture that intimate connection with Jesus so that as we live our life and ministry and we enter into desert seasons and we face disappointment, we don't forget that he knows my name, that he will show up for me. I think we have to be around people, spiritual family, who when the desert is hard will remind us that God still sees us and he knows us and he has not forgotten us. I'm just going to close with this. Emily or the band or someone wants to come up. I think if we can be like Elizabeth, if we can figure out how to keep our life with Jesus personal, I think that we can find flourishing even in the desert, even in the waiting for God to come through. I've been talking about this desert image and was reading a little bit about deserts, and I think something like 1/3 of the world's landmass is made up of some sort of desert region. And there's this one particular really large desert in Chile, the Atacama Desert. And this desert is sort of extraordinary. Scientists have done a lot of studying in this portion of the desert, and they believe that there are portions of this region that have been in extreme desert state for 40 million years. There's a portion of the region that holds the world record for the most number of months without a drop of rain. 173 months. 14 years without any rain in part of this desert. Yet what I found fascinating about it is there are more than 1 million people who live in the Atacama Desert today. Somehow farmers have found a way to draw water from aquifers and from these snow melt streams that come near the desert to grow crops, to feed people, to raise llamas and alpacas. It's not just that people are surviving there, it's that people have found a way to flourish in this dry, historic desert. If you're living in some kind of desert, I think life can flourish even in these barren places. Even for me in my life, as a single woman, getting older, there are a lot of cultural ideas about being a single woman in the West and in the church and how you should feel about that. And for some people, it does feel like a real desert, like a barren place. And if I'm really honest, guys, sometimes I wonder if I should be more unhappy than I am. Especially as I get older. As I get older and I get close to the age where my own ability to have children, even if I were married, decreases, I wonder, should I feel more anxious about that than I do? Should I somehow feel less happy? I think, are there decisions that I've made that have impacted where I am in my life that I'm going to regret 5 years from now, or 10 years from now, or 20 years from now? And when I go there and I begin to reflect on these things, and sometimes it's something that someone says to me, they're consoling me for my singleness, even though I didn't really feel like I needed to be consoled that day. And it triggers this series of thoughts in me, like, should I be more unhappy than I am? And when I go there and I begin to wonder about these things, I find that Jesus is there with me. He's reminding me of the stories of his faithfulness to me throughout the years of my life. Reminding me that in the midst of all that he is doing, he is also at work on my behalf. The coming of his kingdom in this world includes the kingdom coming in my own life. And the fullness of that even in places that seem barren and desert, that the kingdom can come in fullness. We can flourish in those barren places. He leads me to places like Isaiah 54. He says, "Sing, barren woman, you who have never bore a child. Burst into song and shout for joy, you who were never in labor, because more are the children of the desolate woman than of her who has a husband. Do not be afraid, you will not be put to shame. Do not fear disgrace, you will not be humiliated. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. He is called the God of all of the earth." And I know it's a really feminine image of barrenness. But I think this is a word that the Lord had for Zechariah. I think it's a word that he has for you today. And I don't know, maybe if he decides one day to call me out of this life of singleness into marriage, maybe somehow I'll be able to be happy and experience the grace of that gift in some great way because of the grace he's given me in this season to enjoy this gift that I have now. Flourishing can happen in barren places. What's interesting to me as I read about the desert in Chile is that in 2015, in one of the driest places in the world, this part of the region that had been experiencing 14 years without a drop of rain, suddenly in one day had just under an inch of rain. I mean, to Florida, that sounds like nothing to us. We're like, that happened this morning, it'll probably happen again tonight. But imagine an entire desert region that has not seen a drop of rain in 14 years. In one day, almost an inch of rain that ended the drought. 14 years of rainfall in one day. And the amazing thing was that in this beautiful desert where life was already flourishing, where 1 million people had already found a way to thrive, this rain came, and in just a couple weeks, the land was covered in this sheet of flowers. Just bright pink and bright purple for miles, covered with the image of flourishing. Jesus has come to take away the barrenness of the world. He was giving John to Zechariah and Elizabeth for their own joy, but for the joy of the world, because he was going to be the forerunner for the Messiah, for the Lamb who would be slain, who would come and take away the dry, empty death that we live in this world. And I don't know, maybe you've started to lose hope in some place in your life. Maybe the waiting has made you tired, or bitter, or more skeptical, or cynical. Maybe you've started to believe that God will come through for other people, but not for you. But today, as you come to the table, I think Jesus wants to renew your hope in him for the barren places in your own life. So as we begin to come to the table, I just want to invite you into a posture of prayer. That place maybe that God has put his finger on today. Just to begin to offer that to him. Ask him to come in and give you a kind of a rational hope that will endure for as long as you might be in this barren place. A hope that can believe again that God will come through for you. Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, he took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant of my blood. Do this, and whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread, whenever you drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." Whenever you're ready, the body and blood of Jesus broken for you.